Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Okay, so the topic I'd like to present today is more or less what the title is saying, is how we are proposing to use high resolution remote sensing data, most specifically aerial photography and LiDAR data, to provide greater understanding and opportunities for making operational and strategic decisions. Now, before I jump into this, I would like to just make a few statements. First and foremost, Leo from Sundre Forest Products, who I'm sure many of you know, he was supposed to be here, but couldn't make it due to a prior commitment. And really, in a nutshell, Leo is the visionary of this project. And had he been able to make it, he would have led this presentation off with the overall vision that he and his fellow employees at Sundre have for this project. Basically, us here at GreenLink Forestry are not necessarily the visionaries. We are basically just the technical and professional people that take this vision, which we almost always see as a problem or a series of problems, and try to find solutions. Second, we would like to thank FRI and FGrOW, particularly Brian, for allowing us to present on your FGrOW Fall Webinar Series. This may be somewhat outside of the normal topics that FGrOW would cover, so I am very grateful to Brian, who took the time with Robert Froese a ways back to come to our shop and see what we're up to. So really, I do hope that what I present today, I present it in a way that you see the value Brian and Robert potentially saw. Last, I would have to very much thank the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta, who is funding this project. Personally, I admit that I'm not knowledgeable with funding avenues, but I really don't know of another province that has anything similar to ours. Basically, the monetary support FRIA has provided over the last many years has allowed us to greatly improve our understanding, and not just the forest itself, but the other sometimes overlooked values that are just as important to Albertans. Okay, so anyway, now back to the topic. As indicated, I'm going to be talking about a project that we in Sundre have started working on, and will be working on it for over the next couple of years. The project itself is fairly comprehensive, but it can be broken down into two somewhat separate scopes. The first scope is the next Alberta Vegetation Inventory, and I'll get into more detail after this introduction slide, but in a nutshell, it's how we may be able to use high resolution remote sensing data to make the process a lot less time consuming and more cost effective. Just based on our own past experiences and depending on the size and complexity of any particular FMA in the province, conventional first run soft copy AVIs still took us anywhere from 1 to 3 years to complete. And as an example too, for really large FMAs such as Alberta Pacific, I know that they don't even try to complete their entire AVI in one project. They have to do it in what they call a rolling inventory, where only a portion of their inventory is completed and submitted each year. And you just imagine the problems that creates when you're doing, all the other stuff you have to do for forest management plans and everything. Anyway, the term that we had several terms for this approach, but the term I kept hearing more and more over the last few months is the term hybrid. So this is what we're going with right now, is that this is a hybrid approach. It's not the same approach that we took when we did our first inventories. That's the first part of the scope. The second part of the scope I'll be talking about is some of the value-added products that we can obtain from the remote sensing data as well. For this presentation, I will be talking about 3 of several value-added products we will be working on over the course of the next year or 2. First, I'll present the opportunity we now have because we have a second acquisition of LiDAR. Basically, with this, we can now see how well the forest has grown over a particular time period. Second, I'll be talking about that real hot topic today in the forestry world, namely LiDAR-derived stem mapping and the potential it has for increasing our understanding of the forest from the operational scale to the strategic scale. Lastly, and one of the things that I'm actually kind of looking forward to, is the potential to develop empirical growth and yield models And this is not at the plot level, but at the landscape scale, basically using AVI polygons as the plots to drive the growth and yield models. But like I just said prior, this project is comprehensive, and unfortunately I will not have time for the rest of the products that we are going to be developing from this project, but I will at least mention them. The other stuff that we're going to be working on or have already started is a linear disturbance and recreational vehicle access inventory, an automated disturbance state. So this will include things like snags, blowdown, mistletoe, and some other things that we might identify along the way. A disturbance sensitivity map, a riparian areas enhancement program. We're also going to take a stab at updating the provincial derived ecosite phase and updating the provincial recreational opportunities map. And of course, that will be just within Sundre's FMA. Now, before I get into the actual hybrid approach that we're proposing, I think it's prudent to just provide a synopsis of AVI and soft copy in general. So basically, after 2007, vegetation inventories went through what I believe is a technological revolution. I might be overstating it, but this was primarily through the advances made in computer power and software. And just as a side note, I really have no idea where the term soft copy came from. So if anyone could enlighten me, that would be great. I can only guess it is because soft is the antithesis of hard. I don't know. But anyway, that's the term that we use. And I think everybody's aware of the processes that are involved in it. So of course, as some of you may know and still remember, that prior to soft copy, vegetation inventories like phase 1 to phase 3 and most of the early AVI 2.1s were almost always exclusively conducted through a hard copy approach. And then here, I mean, delineation and interpretation were made directly onto paper copies of aerial photography, then digitized into a computer environment. I started with GreenLink just when the last hard copy inventory for this company was being carried out, so I don't profess to be an expert in this category by any means. However, 3 things that I believe with the hard copy inventories are that: 1, hard copy inventories were repeated for a particular area, so the slate had to be always wiped clean, so to speak. In other words, inventories had to be started from scratch, and I can only speak to what I've heard, but I can only imagine what may happen when you replace one abstract of the forest with another several years earlier, or several years after. 2, relatively speaking, the line work was of low resolution and extremely inaccurate at fine scales. And I used to hear all the time about this penwood thing on the boundary, which could represent actually anywhere between 15 to 20 meters on the ground. And 3, sort of a general comment, hard copy inventories worked fine at the strategic scale, but not so well at the tactical or operational scale. Hence, when hard copy inventories existed, there was always a need for boots on the ground, things like PHA surveys, etc. So back to the soft copy. This combination of computer power and software came along shortly before the sort of economic availability of high resolution digitally acquired remote sensing data. And this included aerial photography and LiDAR. And this not only increased our accuracy with vegetation attributes, but really also allowed us to nail down the line work as well. And what I'm saying, and important to our vision of future inventories, even though the first soft copy inventory had to be done from scratch, what we really believe the second soft copy inventory does not. If I could define a pillar of a hybrid approach, it would be improve on what is already there and don't change what you don't need to change. So pause here for a thing, because I think it's a good time to make a point, because I can't emphasize enough that although the soft copy approach is in combination with high resolution remote sensing is a significant improvement over the older approach, no vegetation inventory is currently perfect. We are striving for perfection, but I think we're still, a ways away from that. So expanding on the pillar I just mentioned, we basically view the first soft copy as a great starting point, with the idea that most of the ABI polygons have been delineated and interpreted correctly. What we just want to focus on are the polygons that can use improvement. So how we do that is really a major focus of this project. So this is where we currently see hybrid inventories moving forward. Before I get into the figure on the right, I would just like to emphasize that this is still relatively theoretical. Some of our internal models and processes have been drafted and tested, but not finalized within sort of the big picture of hybrid vegetation inventories. But anyway, back to the figure. The first thing I would like to say is that most of what interpretation is can be basically broken down broadly into delineation and attributes. We basically start with the soft copy inventory that we are trying to update. In our case, it is the ABI approved by GOA in 2015. There's the fundamental first step with this, and actually even with any inventory, is that we have to do the anthropogenic update. Now this includes any sort of oil and gas, any obviously cut blocks and stuff like that, and basically make sure that we update those disturbances and that they are part of the new inventory. This for us is still a manual process. We still have to go through the whole inventory and make sure that all the anthropogenic information is included. And this we rely fairly heavily on DIDS layers and cut block boundaries provided by Sundre. Basically following that update, using ortho and LiDAR data, the inventory is run through a series of vetting models, mainly written or will be written in the SAS programming language. And basically the purpose of these vetting models, as the name suggests, is to identify outages in delineation and attributes over the entire polygon population. And basically the idea here now is that polygons identified with outages through these models will be inspected by a certified ABI interpreter and updated if warranted. Another final note that once we have sort of a completed inventory that we're happy with, we'll also use the LiDAR data then to update the heights and the crown closures. If I could speak to a basic current unknowns, right now we're not really sure how effective the vetting models will be. The next couple of unknowns have a direct impact on efficiency and subsequently time and cost. First, how much time will this take? And second, how better do we actually have to make the inventory? These are very simple questions that we still aren't very clear. Basically, we can view this too as sort of an effort versus gain scenario, where we have to be very careful that whatever effort we put in, we get the maximum gain out of it. So give you a sort of overall view of how the vetting models will work. In summary, the first step is to intercept the LiDAR and the ortho data with the ABI polygons. Of course, we need the information tied to those before we can inspect them. Next, basically in a nutshell, we look for outliers outside the normal or average spectral response. For this step, the trick really is to find the right metric and the right statistic that tells you that something is off with the delineation or the attributes with any particular polygon. So just speaking to delineation, which has a little bit of a different vetting process than the attributes, we are not only trying to find errors in the delineation, but also increase the resolution, i.e. increase the polygon count. We already started to explore some delineation vetting models, and one currently shows a lot of promise and provides an example how we are approaching the whole idea of the vetting models. It starts with the assumption that the metric of choice is normally distributed within the polygon. In this case here that I'm showing you on the slide, the metric explored was one calculated from the LiDAR data. Now we could have many metrics, and we're going to look at several other metrics, and these will include ortho data, other variables derived from LiDAR data. This is a height metric that I calculated, and the slide shows two stands or polygons in Sundre's FMA overlaid with a 2020 Canopy height model. The top stand clearly shows a disturbance since the last inventory. In this case, it's actually a blowdown, and the bottom stand does not. When we put the height metrics on histograms, you can see clear differences in the distributions, with the bottom one showing a very normal distribution, and the top one is clearly not normal. Oh, sorry, just going to go back a slide. Okay, so with this slide, I want to make two important points. The first point is that the example shown here is obvious visually, both in terms of the polygons on the left and the histograms on the right. However, the point of this exercise is automation. We really can't rely on the two figures on the left, because that basically, looking at things like the two figures on the left, because that basically entails having an interpreter look at every polygon, which is what we're trying to avoid. Likewise, we obviously can't look at every histogram for every polygon, because we would be looking at, thousands, tens of thousands of histograms. I mean, really, the whole point of automation is that we run the entire suite of polygons through a series of algorithms, and these, in a very quick way, tell us which polygons we have to visit and which ones we do not. Leo really likes to use this term, a focused effort, and I really agree too. So therefore, we have to come up with a statistic that we can rely on that tells us something is wrong with the delineation. In this case, you can see I've sort of plotted a circle and a triangle, and I'm not sure if you can see this graph clearly, but the circle is basically the mean of the distribution, and the triangle is the mode. And this is something that we can output easily. So basically, in this case, you can see the mean and the mode are pretty far apart, whereas in the normal distribution, the mean and the mode are fairly close together, which is what you would expect. And so potentially we could use this in a model to flag polygons that really we need to go and look at. So the second point I'd like to make, and kind of like what I've already said, is that the examples shown here are very obvious. I mean, they're two extremes of non-normality and normality. So really what we're going to start looking at, what about the polygons that are not as extreme as these? And basically what I'm saying is here is how, basically what I'm saying is how far does the mean have to be from the mode before we tag it as a problem? This is something that we're still going to have to work out. And again, this is just one way that we can look at this. We still have other variables that we got to look at and explore. It's really part of the core part of the project is finding these metrics that are going to tell us, okay, it's going to basically focus our effort. So right now, the attribute vetting models are nowhere near as far along as the delineation models. This slide, though, shows a very simplistic example how we see these vetting models working, though. This is completely hypothetical, by the way. But what we're looking at to do is basically stratify the inventory into something meaningful. So in this case, basically finding all the polygons that have greater than 60% aspen cover, say. And then we have to go in and we got to find a metric that actually correlates well with this stand type. Again, this is hypothetical, so let's just say IR became an important metric for aspen cover. What we would do is we'd put it on a sort of a distribution, and again, this is a normal distribution, but there's lots of other things that we can look at, because what we're really interested in, if this here is more or less the average IR response for this stand type, what I'm most interested in, well, why are these same stand type exhibiting this type of IR class and or this type of IR class? It's basically looking at the extremes or outliers. And again, this is a very simplistic example of how we're going to initially approach this. So if I could just sort of do a closing summary with the hybrid approach. I'd basically summarize our approach with sort of, I don't know what you call them, three guiding principles, but what we're really looking or keeping in the back of our minds is, what is the effort versus the amount of gain? What are the metrics and statistics that tell us there is an issue with the delineation or attributes in a polygon? And a really important one is, where do we draw the line? I mean, how many polygons do we have to visit or check? Because obviously that has a production and cost and efficiency implication. Okay, so that's basically it for the hybrid approach. What I'd like to talk about now is some of the value-added products that we're looking at. I alluded to that, the landscape level productivity, so requiring a minimum two acquisition periods of LiDAR. The stem mapping, which will lead to forest metrics and wood profile, and then growth and yield. So when we started hearing that forest companies were acquiring new LiDAR, we quickly realized that we could now look at forest growth more on a massive scale. Basically, where over the last X number of years, were in the FMA has the forest had the best and worst growth. And I think this sort of slide shows it in very dramatic fashion. This is a canopy height model. This is an area in Sundre's FMA. This is LiDAR flown in October 2006. And if you can get your head wrapped around how we symbolize the canopy height models, it's pretty obvious that the forest has grown over that time frame. Okay, so when we actually wrote the FGrOW proposal for this, we realized that for this project, or this value-added product, we would have to stick handle around the fact that the first LiDAR acquisition in Sundre's FMA, as in all FMAs in the province, were flown at different years. In Sundre's case, unlike other areas, the acquisition period, though, is fairly condensed, 2005 to 2008. However, I still felt that it was something that we had to deal with. One of the things we are exploring right now is what I'm terming MAHI, or mean annual height increment, which is basically just a simple calculation requiring two variables, and it's very similar to what we all understand MAI to be. But basically, it requires the variable growth, which is simply the second acquisition height minus the first acquisition height. And then we need growing seasons, which, as the name implies, is the second acquisition year minus the first acquisition year. Now, I'm not going to get into details with that, but we also have to take into account the month and day of the year, because what we're trying to calculate is growing seasons and not necessarily acquisition year. And so if the acquisition was in the middle of summer, we have to account for that as part of a growing season and not an entire growing season. So now MAHI is now just simply the growth divided by the number of growing seasons. Several weeks ago, I did try a preliminary run of this on Sundre's entire cut block population. So this slide represents an area in Sundre's FMA with cut blocks colored by relative growth. So basically I compared, which was just a basic subtraction method, the total MAHI of each cut block to the overall average MAHI of all the cut blocks. So this gives us a quick overall visual on performance. In this case, excuse me. In this case, above average are light to dark browns, with the darker the brown, the higher the MHI is above the average, followed by yellows, which are around the average, and then the blues, which are below average, with the darker blues being farther below average. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that this is just an example how we can present the data. There are like really more ways that we can do this, and we will explore as many opportunities as possible during this project. Also note that we will also have to account for the block or stand age, since of course growth over time is non-linear, so that's something we got to look into. So sort of on a closing note with this, I'd just like to really say that I really believe that this is real, sorry, a lot of reallys in there. This is really powerful stuff. Like first, I mean, really, because it's very simple to do. Second, I really see this as a direct measure of site productivity on a landscape scale. In the past, well, we still use them, but traditionally we use site index as the measure of productivity, which, as we know, is based on, you know, several important assumptions, often difficult to prove or disprove. With this, we basically no longer have to talk about site potential. You look at this and you say, there's no shred of doubt which stands are growing well and which stands are not doing so well. Sort of on a side with this too, I also see a potential to integrate this information into the site index equations themselves, but I would leave that to sort of the provincial experts like Jula or Xiangming. I wouldn't try and tackle that myself. Okay, so everybody's favorite topic of the day. So this figure shows where we are with automated stem mapping. So just please take note that I changed the main header on the slide to LiDAR point filtering from stem mapping that I had before. And I can only explain this through a story, which I hope is not too long-winded, but back around 2013, we personally started realizing that canopy height models from LiDAR could be used for a whole lot more than just delineation and assigning heights and crown closures to AVI polygons. And this realization was germinated at a LiDAR conference I attended several years ago, where I saw a presentation where the researcher was fairly successfully too, I believe, trying to spatially locate tree stems in a fairly complicated deciduous forest in the US. I believe he was using high resolution LiDAR at the time, but unfortunately I can't find the presentation or even remember the name of the presenter. But anyway, what's really important is that that's where, for me, the seed was planted. I really thought, well, our forests are generally not that complicated, so we should be able to apply something similar here. At this time, we had 1.1 ppm GOA LiDAR. To make a somewhat long story short, I never really thought about this initially from an individual tree inventory standpoint. Certainly saw the potential for it, but quickly saw the challenges I would face, and particularly with such low resolution LiDAR. When presented, the algorithm that we use actually looks like a stem map, or if I can say ITI. However, I don't believe this is necessarily to be the case. I always referred to this algorithm as a LiDAR point filter. And this has been over the last several years. And I'll try to explain through a couple of points about the algorithm itself. First, the algorithm that we use and that we are using for this product does not use point clouds. It is really solely based on eliminating what I term the noise of canopy height models. And this is oversimplistic, but essentially the algorithm locates the top of a tree and assesses all the other LiDAR points around it to determine if these are the tops of other trees or parts of the same tree. This is carried out using SAS through a series of grids and decision matrices, and is basically an elimination process, so AKA a filter. Second, once the algorithm is applied, I am only interested in the XY coordinate of each filtered LiDAR point, in so much that it tells me which AVI polygon it is in. and that's a very important distinction. I want to make a pause here just to make another point, because I admit I am very ignorant how the other models locate the tops of trees or stem map trees, as I really tend to work in a silo here. Anyway, not knowing how other algorithms or models work, this algorithm really is not statistically based or AI based. And admittedly, I still really don't understand how AI works. In reality, this is just what I call a brute force algorithm. And I'm not really sure if this algorithm works better than others, since I've never really been able to compare them. What I do believe is that this one does work pretty well on the Canopy. It's not perfect, but it's really, really fast. So like just in Sundre's case, using just one powerful computer and one SAS application at the 1 meter canopy height model resolution, this model, the algorithm, was assigned to Sundre's entire FMA in less than 3 days. And that's just using one application. At the 50 centimeter resolution, however, which is what you're looking at, it took a lot longer, but still slightly less than 3 weeks. Now, this is just computer time, and we could always speed up the process by running more applications or if we had to, getting more computers processing the data. But I wanted to run both separately on just one application on one computer, just to compare the differences. Oh, and yeah, I apologize if this sounds self-promoting. I mean, the last thing I want to do is give the impression that I'm using this forum to push a product, but I feel it's important to provide some background information on this algorithm, because really it's not the algorithm itself that's important to this particular project, but how we are going to use the data from it. Now, having said that, budget was used in this project for this algorithm, but it wasn't used to change how the algorithm works in any way. It was just so that we can transition it from a 1 meter canopy height model resolution, because that's where the original algorithm came from, to a 50 centimeter canopy height model resolution. So anyway, I'm just going to, where we're going with this, if I can sum it up, really what we're trying to do is we're now making the AVI polygon the point of sampling. So in more direct terms, we're basically trying to go from this, the TSP, to this, the polygon, as the main sampling unit. That's really, that's all it's all about. There's not much more to it to that, because what we're really seeing is trying to increase our sample size over the whole FMA. So now that we've located the main steps, of course, this is pretty common practice now with this type of modeling. We have to obtain important tree metrics the same way we would do in a TSP. As you all know, the three most important metrics in any mensuration program are tree species, tree height, and DBH. Obviously, we already have a fairly accurate height from the LiDAR data. So that just leaves us tree species and DBH. Also, in order to get the most accurate DBH, we have to determine the tree species first. So before I get into tree species and DBH, I'm just going to jump ahead here a little bit just to emphasize something. One I kind of alluded to prior, but did not emphatically state. That is, really our objective here is to assign merchantable volume to each LiDAR point. Once this is done, all the individual tree metrics assigned to each LiDAR point gets rolled up to the polygon level. The so-called stem map now is just simply a byproduct and is not used for really anything else after. So this also provides an advantage, because now I'm not as concerned about the accuracy of tree species assigned to each single point. Therefore, I can use the ABI tree species calls, both in the overstory and understory, to help me assign tree species. Now, having said this, we can still use other information to help us refine that process. In this case, I know most of you are aware of this. This is not like Eureka or rocket science, that we can use 4-band orthophoto data, particularly under leaf-off conditions, to determine if the LiDAR point is more likely a deciduous tree or a coniferous tree. Basically, this is a normalized difference vegetation index that you're looking at in the figure, mostly called NDVI. And basically here, the lighter colors are deciduous and the darker colors are coniferous. It's not the best representation of it. In a lot of cases, it's a lot more clear. But this came out of a stand, and here's the ABI call for that stand. Another way I use the ABI call to increase the accuracy of the tree species prediction, if there is an understory, is the actual ABI overstory and understory heights themselves. So this tells me where the tree species most likely lie vertically. So basically what I'm saying is that each LiDAR point is being tagged as an overstory point or understory point and I use this information from the inventory. So basically, the take-home message here is that anything around 12 meters, the likelihood of that point getting assigned an AW species is very low. Likewise, anything around the 20 meter and above, and it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I won't necessarily bore you with all that stuff. The likelihood of those LiDAR points getting assigned a white spruce are a lot less than being assigned an aspen. So now that we have tree species and height, obviously we need DBH. Several years ago, Xiangming came up with some very useful height to DBH equations, which seem to work great on this LiDAR data. And I think other people are using them as well. So now that we have tree species, height, and DBH, we're basically home free. We can now calculate the all-important merchantable volume for each LiDAR point. So now once we have that, we can assign all sorts of fun stuff to each ABI polygon. So basically, this is a table taken out of a data dictionary that I think some of you who I've sent this to are here, you will be familiar with. This is basically what can be assigned to each ABI polygon now. So on the left are just basic stand metric stuff, which is pretty common stuff that we assign through growth and yield strata and TSP data. And then we can also assign wood profile metrics to each ABI polygon. Things like total number of 9-foot logs, all that kind of stuff. So to me, it's kind of like pretty powerful stuff. So now we have all these metrics assigned to each polygon uniquely based on what was in on each polygon. Hope I said that clearly. So back in 2015-16, we had an opportunity to test this out in S17 with cut block scale data. Basically, cut blocks were provided to us and run through both the LiDAR-derived volumes and empirical growth and yield volumes. So this is where I want to make an important point. So on the left is the LiDAR-derived volumes. So from the models or the algorithms and the metrics that I just mentioned previously, assigned to cut block boundaries. And on the right are volumes assigned through growth and yield curves. Important thing I want to make is that this is not a magic wand, what we're doing here. There's still operationally, you can see with the scale data that there's still variability on a sort of block-to-block basis. And then so this would reciprocate. This is all the same thing when we assign it to polygons. In this case, however, what we did find was that the LiDAR predicted volumes were more sort of on average predicting better at a tactical level than the growth and yield volumes. And we found this in other cases in other areas of the province, but we haven't really tested this like exclusively. Another sort of with this project point that I'd like to make is that the actual growth and yield volumes in this case actually had a little bit better R-square values. And this, I think, has something to do with the fact that the growth and yield process itself through the TSPs and stratas artificially sort of decreases the variances across the land base, whereas LiDAR-derived volumes sample the entire suite of polygon variation. So just a couple of quick slides here at the end on growth and yield, because I see we're getting pretty close to out of time here. Basically, if I could summarize it, we're basically trying to increase the sample size. Each AVI polygon is uniquely sampled to its own sort of variability and its characteristics. And I can see a real potential here for these driving growth and yield curves, because now we have sample sizes going from, commonly from 100 to 1,000 plots, somewhere around there, to over 50,000 plots. So here's an example of an empirical growth, and this is all hypothetical. So I just kind of made this all up just to try to prove the point, but this is sort of where we see this potentially going. This is an example of an empirical growth and yield curve driven by TSP data. Of course, plot sampling can be expensive and can often be restricted by access. So in this example, most of the data is sort of located around sort of a narrow sort of age range. Basically, after around 150 years, we really don't know a lot about what's going on with these stands. And often, I've seen these in growth and yield curves, we start making arbitrary sort of lines out past where the data occurs. I mean, in this case too, at 150 years, it might not matter because it's more or less past peak MAI. So sort of take that with a grain of salt. So basically, the idea, what we're trying to do is to drive your growth and yield curves. Of course, weighted by if we use the polygons, we've dramatically increased our sample size, and that's the most horrible shotgun blast I've ever created. Basically, you've dramatically increased your sample size, and the entire land base in any particular strata is represented. It is now, Brian, when I showed Brian this a while back, he said, this is a census. So I just love that term. So yeah, basically every polygon now is represented in your growth and yield curves. Okay, so just moving along a little quicker. So this is the last slide. And if I could sort of summarize the sort of pros and cons of polygons versus TSPs. Obviously, the census part of the polygon sort of method. People are telling me, it's interesting, people are telling me that LiDAR-derived tree heights are more accurate than field sampling tree heights. So I just kind of put that in there as a pro, but I'll let everybody else debate that. I'm not so sure about that. Obviously, with TSPs, observed tree species, because we're modeling tree species, and measured DBH, because we're modeling DBH, the polygon method. Now, obviously you see CC there, and I'm sure a bunch of you already know what that means. It's not something that I talked about yet, but one of the things we still don't have is the condition codes of the trees, and this is very important because right now, the way the model works, it does not know important things like whether the tree is dead or not, whether it has a broken top. These are things that are part of this project that we are going to work towards, and hopefully we can clarify it. So basically, in a nutshell, we are going to try and improve the model tree species part of it. The model DBH, I'm fairly confident with. We might do some slight adjustments or localized calibration. The condition codes, we are looking at maybe using the NDVI because it's in because in Sundre's FMA, in the areas where they don't have a lot of deciduous, we may be able to identify snags at a fairly accurate level. And if we can relate this to the algorithm, then we can at least account for that. Otherwise, we might have to go into the TSP data or PSP data and get some of that dead tree information.